Welcome to this interface. We are fortunate to have Professor Jonathan Dollimore here. For people in the academia, this is not an unfamiliar name. The 80s in Britain witnessed a kind of paradigm shift in the field of humanities, and it largely owes to people like Professor Jonathan Dollimore, Professor Alan Sealfield. For them, literature was not something to be divorced from its context. The intimate connection between text and context was something that they unearthed through the political as well as cultural interventions. And the political Shakespeare that came out in the year 1985 marked a new beginning in the field of English studies as well as the field of humanities. So, I will be talking to Professor Jonathan Dollimore about cultural materialism, his new interests that are death studies, censorship, and even those studies related to many other fields, because his interests are quite wide-ranging. So, in this interview, welcome Professor Jonathan Dollimore. I would like to ask you, now it's almost more than 2 decades that you and Professor Alan Sealfield and people like that actually began paying attention to the political aspect of Shakespeare, which was since the beginning itself. But now, looking from the vantage point of the 21st century, what do you feel, how much has cultural materialism achieved? How much has it failed to achieve, if at all? And what do you feel about your past, academic?
So, when we began to think about what cultural materialism would be, we were fairly open-ended. We wanted it to be a practice which would evolve in practice. Yeah. In other words, it wasn't a fixed creed formulated at the outset in ways that were never going to change. But there were certain things we were committed to. On the one hand, we had to break out of the stifling critical atmosphere of the time, particularly around Shakespeare studies, which was particularly conservative and particularly reactionary. It seemed to us that a lot of what was written about Shakespeare was out of date almost before it was written, and it was mainly written for other academics. It was mostly a waste of time, to put it bluntly. We wanted our practice to be 3 things: historical, political, and philosophical. Now, I think that in recent years, it's probably fair to say that the political aspect of it has dominated, and there has emerged a kind of politicized historiography, which has done many useful things. But I do think that the philosophical side of it has been left behind somewhat, and it has produced what I think is a very second-rate form of cultural materialism, with people, as it were, going through the motions, gesturing towards radical ideas, without actually really going very deep into the ideas themselves, or indeed that which they are supposed to be criticizing. Now, as regards the influence of cultural materialism, well, I mean, we could all hope for more. It has, of course, been influential in the institutions of education, and I think that, along with many other changes, has produced some very positive results. But I think this is true not just of cultural materialism, but of all critical practices. At the moment when they become assimilated or even partially successful, there is always a danger that they will be taken in directions which are not conducive to their full potential. All human institutions tend to tame, to dilute, to redirect, to contain, in order to make things more palatable. Yeah. And I think to some extent that has happened with cultural materialism, and it's something which I find myself wanting to resist.
Actually, you started with a lot of iconoclastic zeal, wanted to, actually smash the idols. But what you ended up doing was actually those idols that you wanted to break, actually they became, became invigorated through your own mission. For example, Shakespeare became a greater idol, a greater, the one who bestrides the globe, as Mark Antony is being referred to by Cleopatra. Isn't it what happened through Shakespeare? You talks about signification and legitimacy and stuffs like that. But didn't Shakespeare become greater following your iconoclastic zeal?
Yes, but first of all sorts of new things were being said around Shakespeare. All sorts of people who had hitherto been excluded from involvement in Shakespeare were now included. And there was a sense in which Shakespeare himself could be, even though he was revitalized in the way that you say. So much more was being said in and around him. And it's wrong to think of the canon as always reactionary. What is reactionary about the canon is that normally it polices what can and cannot be said in relation to the figures. And if you open up the canon so that different voices can be heard, different people can be involved with the canonical figure, it seems to me that you are doing something very different from what was done before. But you are right to the extent that, yes, there is a way that Shakespeare is still canonical, but I would still say it depends what we are saying about him that is important, not the fact that he has this particular status. And indeed, I would add, he is a great writer.
Yeah.
He's a very important writer. For me, the canonical status of Shakespeare isn't really the issue. I'll tell you what really is the object of criticism now for cultural materialism. It's the heritage culture industry.
Okay.
Because now that the universities have been marketized, now that culture itself has been marketized in the West, and now is a source of national income,
Yeah, right.
the most dishonest, the most fraudulent form of high culture is around the tourist industry.
Yeah, okay.
And about the heritage culture industry. And of course, a country like England or Britain, which has this immensely rich culture, tends to be ripe for that process of marketization. And the task now is to try and rescue Shakespeare and many other writers from the heritage culture industry, because it is fraudulent and it is dishonest.
Actually, that's quite an interesting observation when you talked about opening up the canon.
Yeah.
Opening up the canon was, in a sense, I think, opening a can of worms. And probably, I think, Toni Morrison was right when she said that canon making was also a simultaneous process along with canon making, C-A-N-N-O-N, means for subjugation of the marginalized. And you rightly gave voice to, the marginalized sections like the prostitutes, like the sodomites, and such people. That's true. But cultural materialism also talks about the end of something called human, and you preface, or you have written somewhere that your basic tendency is anti-humanism. How would you define anti-humanism?
Yeah, no, that isn't quite correct. In my first book, Radical Tragedy, I very much wanted to take attention away from anti-humanism. Yeah. That is an idea which originates in France. It doesn't travel well, it doesn't translate well, and I wanted to use more traditional categories than that. But I take your point, there is a crucial issue involved here, and it is whether, in what sense is the human being at the center of the discourse. And there was, in this conservative way of thinking about things, there was this notion that really Shakespeare was about the universal human condition. Yeah. Something which spoke to all people regardless of race, creed, color, gender. And this was clearly false. He didn't. So that has to be challenged. And the way of challenging it is to show how often the individual is in fact constituted by his or her social formation. So often they are the site of conflicts, even very powerful people. I mean, kings, queens, and so on. They are the site of cultural conflicts. And rather than concentrate on them as an individual, what is important is to see them as exemplifying those conflicts in their culture. And if I could just come back to your previous question, just a further point. It's true that Shakespeare is still central, but what has happened in the last 20, 30 years is actually Shakespeare in virtually everywhere is now optional as a focus of study. Hitherto he was compulsory, and that's a huge shift, and it is part of a general shift away from the literature of the past to the literature of the present, which I actually personally regret. I wish more students were studying Shakespeare, but it's their choice.
Again, that's the same thing I think Harold Bloom had issues with. He had, for example, said that there's no God but God, and his name is Shakespeare. And regarding when you talked about the canon being broken off and Shakespeare being made an optional and such stuff, and giving voice to the marginalized, all those things are great. But when I read your book or parts of your book, Desire, you talked about the various, your own personal experiences, your own personal sexual life, if I can put it so. What happens, a person can be bisexual, heterosexual, homosexual, or whatever, but won't this all lead to a sort of anarchy? That's often the bogey of anarchy is being raised by people who are interested in this discourse. How would you respond to that?
Well, you know what they said about women getting the vote?
Yeah.
It would produce anarchy.
Yeah.
Almost any social change has been resisted with the claim that it will produce social conflict, anarchy, disorder. And in fact, history proves otherwise.
Okay.
And I'll say something else. It is very often you will find that the ethical dimension of dissident cultures is sometimes stronger than the dominant one.
Okay.
For example, if you look at gay liberation, look at feminism, look at transgender, often these movements are not just about saying, we want to be included, we want a seat at the table. They say that, of course they say that. But what they also say is that our exclusion is part of a radical problem with human society. So their demand for inclusion or acceptance or rights actually goes along with a vision of how the society can be transformed for the benefit of all. So there is a strong utopian political drive behind a lot of the liberation movements, which is anything but anarchic. So often you will find, when you look at them in retrospect, it's not always apparent in practice, but in retrospect, you will find that they have taken certain concepts from the dominant culture, revitalized them, made them more inclusive, and then handed them back to the culture. And in retrospect, we look back and we think, yes, that was a progressive development.
Yeah, okay. In your book, I think Radical Tragedies, you talk about, I think I'm quoting you, but it's from memory, I'm quoting you. It's something like only a very naive belief would tell us that no kind of repression is required.
Yes.
Some kind of repression is required. You seem to agree on that. But to what extent will be that repression is required? Who is going to decide or determine that this much repression is okay, and beyond that it's not okay? So any kind of repression will lead to censorship, will lead to repression. So what's going to be, where we're going to draw the line?
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. I do believe that. In this, I follow in very loosely the work of Sigmund Freud, that I think that the price of civilization is always a high degree of repression, suppression, and renunciation. And it is one of the reasons why often cultures are described as sick. I mean, Freud himself said that civilization is inherently sick, and it's the price you pay for civilization. The other part of your question is even more interesting, which is who decides. All political struggles are around this.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the idea that liberation movements involve some complete removal of restraint, whatever that would be, is nonsense. Because, as I said earlier, all liberation movements actually embrace a very strong ethical dimension as part of their politics, a notion of what society might be in a radically different and better form. And I think that that is the aspect which we should be concentrating on. The struggles around repression, they are there and they will always be there, and they are very, very important. But the idea that, for example, let me give you an example. There was a notion that gay men particularly, shouldn't become parents because they are sexually promiscuous and they will probably end up kind of, abusing the child. This was a very strong notion, and in many cases, gay men were not allowed to adopt. If you actually look at what happens with gay men and indeed lesbians, they probably are, not all, but probably most, are more conscientious as parents than their heterosexual counterparts. And that is part of the vision of the alternative. So the people who are obsessed with anarchy and immorality and so on, they really don't know what is happening. They have no interest in finding out. What they are really expressing is their disturbance at having their own power challenged, or their own privileged position challenged.
Okay. Tomorrow somebody else becomes, means the authority. There's an alternative, and you talked about the alternative having its own ethical view. So what kind of, you also talk in your book about what's called the metaphysical residue that has been haunting the Western civilization. I think it has been haunting not only the Western civilization, we too have our own metaphysical residue, or more than metaphysical residue. So what happens is, Freud had himself said that but for the accidental metaphysical trappings that humans have inherited, a man would just, murder his father and sleep with his mother. I don't know whether it was a very crude way of putting it. So we always posit some kind of ethicality. How can we be guaranteed or be sure that the kind of, materialistic ethical concepts are going to be more, are to be based on more secure footings than the so-called metaphysical ethics that we inherited from religions?
Right. I think there's a very important distinction there between metaphysics and ethics. They are not the same thing. And when I talk about the residual metaphysics, I'm talking much more about the Western obsession with an absolute reality. In other words, it's there, of course, in the Christian notion of heaven. It's there in the Platonic idea of the forms. All the way through, there is this idea that somewhere else there is a more ultimate reality, a more important reality, a deeper reality. And it is that which really gives meaning to our culture. Now, a materialist wants to say, no, that is an illusion. What we have is the here and now. We have human history. We have the material realities. And it's this that we've got to struggle with. And my point about the residual is that even those of us who believe we are materialists will find that the history of our culture is so deeply within us, in our language, particularly in our language, that we end up reproducing these ideas even as we think we have escaped them. And to come back to my earlier point, the crucial dimension of philosophy is to allow us to see that this is happening, to always, as it were, have the intellectual gaze feeding back on ourselves as well as those whose arguments we contest. I mean, this is very, very important now in the era of identity politics, because I think that as identity politics have replaced more traditional political forms, we have a kind of extraordinary narcissism and arrogance and historical ignorance as the basis for political exchange or confrontation. And I think that we need to try and recover, again, it's a philosophical point that I'm making, we need to discover some perspective which enables us to see our own relative position, the limitations of our own position. Because, my God, if we don't find some way of talking across these increasingly conflicted divides, and I'm thinking about the US, the UK, continental Europe, the way that these divides are opening up, it augurs very, very badly. And you may find this kind of odd coming from me, but I do think that we need a degree of humility in our intellectual exchanges. And it's lacking in identity politics. There is a sense of entitlement which goes along with a deep sense of ignorance, and I regret that very much. It's another reason why I wish students spent more time studying the past as opposed to just the present. Because if you just study the present, you are allowed to think that, the issues concerning you, your own culture, your own milieu, are paramount. And actually then, often they are not. Certainly not in the West anyway. We have this phrase, have you heard it? It's a first world problem. Yeah. And it's a very useful phrase, because when you hear people demanding certain rights from a position of extraordinary privilege, it's useful to remind them that demand is itself a first world.
Okay, let's slightly depart, and anyhow, this takes us to another issue. For example, we had a materialistic kind of conception. We had a materialistic experiment in Soviet Union, which didn't succeed. For example, it replaced the metaphysics with a kind of another kind of metaphysics, I would say. It didn't succeed. So, and one of your interests is studies related to censorship and all. But we had the worst kind of censorship in the communist, old communist regime. You might be familiar with the new writer called Ismail Kadra, who writes. So what actually is the current scenario regarding, the censorship? There is some form of censorship everywhere. And the first world, which you talked about, the first world problem, does it more efficiently and effectively than the third world. In the first world, you have got invisible mechanisms that control what can be heard, what is said, who speaks the loudest. And people are also talking about the great chain of speaking, where only some people have the privilege of talking. So what are your insights into this area?
Well, let's take the first part of your question first, and the massive failure of the Soviet Union. I mean, this was a hideous part of human history, and the extent to which Marxism and the left and materialist philosophers fed into that, they are culpable. Okay. Now, there's a writer, a currently very influential writer in the US called Jordan Peterson. He's a #1 bestseller. He has a massive YouTube following. And it's his argument that all forms of Marxism eventually lead to totalitarianism and mass murder. Okay? That's his argument. All forms of Marxism. They always have and they always will. Now, it seems to me that there are parts of the world, including in Kerala, which suggest that he is wrong. But this goes back to my previous point. Anyone today who calls themselves a Marxist or a communist and is ignorant or casual about that history is culpable. And, as it were, they have a tragic burden to bear to the extent that they are in that tradition. I can't predict the future. All I would say to you that other forms, Nazism, fascism, imperialism, they themselves have been murderous regimes with murderous outcomes. But the point that you make is a very important one. Now, on the question of repression, censorship, this I think is a very interesting topic, because yes, all cultures involve some kind of censorship, but there are different forms of censorship, and that in the Soviet Union was massively different to that which prevails in the West. We ourselves are in cultural materialism, we are concerned with ideological censorship. That is to say, you remember the famous quote of Marx, religion is the opium of the people. So in a sense, we are concerned with the opium as it works, not just in religious terms, but all sorts of terms. I mean, I think it was Adorno, or maybe it's Horkheimer, who said that very often in the West, freedom is only the freedom to always choose the same. So, as it were, there is already a way in which freedom itself is controlled. It is a kind of censorship in a way. And it seems to me that also the critique of censorship is part of any intellectual process, because the ruling classes, Marx said, the ruling ideas are always the ideas of the ruling classes. And I think he was fundamentally right. But the point is, it's not just the ruling classes. Anyone in power, even in a subordinate position, even that person or that group's ideas will tend to dominate. In other words, power of any kind in any context tends to reduce the dominance of the ideas of the powerful. Whether that's human nature or human history or a bit of both, I don't know, but it is the case. So therefore, I think that, yes, intellectual work always has to be challenging that. And it's challenging it not in the name of, a free-for-all, because once again, intellectuals are often the people who actually at some level affirm the importance of restraint. So intellectual critique is really not the same as liberty or indulgence, and intellectual critique is very different from the Soviet Union, where we are literally talking about incarcerating people, murdering people because of the things they say. In other words, it is a murdering of precisely those intellectuals, typically, not only of those people who are exposing the ideological basis of the apparatus of control.
Okay, that was quite interesting, but since you have, I have to move on to the next topic, because censorship is part of your studies, and you're also very much interested in something, which we don't have very much here in India, related death studies. Humanity is, I don't know whether I can use the word humanity, because we were talking about the dissolution of humanity that Claude Lévi-Strauss had dreamt of, and but though you were using humanity's common nature and all, I was a bit confused about it, probably perplexed. But shall I ask you, you're talking about death, and humanity has always approached death in terms of, metaphysical, whatever insights metaphysics could give them. So now you have, thanks to you, I think there's a new interest, and thanks to scholars like you, there's a new interest in death studies. How would you, explain what death studies is briefly?
So there are two dimensions to this, and this is where I move into a very, very different direction. Yeah. In fact, some of my political friends have reproached me for even working in this area. They think it's morbid, pathological, unhealthy.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so be it. Death studies in one form is really about the amelioration of the problem of death. In other words, it's about how to care for people in the last days of their life. So it's about, as it were, demystifying death and somehow helping people to die in a humane way. But that is not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the way that death is one of the motors of Western culture. That's to say that death, it becomes the obsession, an obsession of culture. And it goes back to Western theology. It goes back to the idea of the fall, where because of the transgression of Adam and Eve, death becomes to inhabit desire. Shakespeare says, desire is death. Death is working within us. Death is what drives us. There is always inside of ourselves as individuals and our cultures an inner tendency to dissolution. Freud called it the death drive. And people think Freud was being radically innovative. He was not. Freud was simply rewriting something that was there in Western culture, but which people preferred not to see. So it's a very pathological, strange, paradoxical thing. But the book that I wrote, Death, Desire and Loss in Western Culture, is really about the centrality of death in some of our most elevated philosophical enterprises, and the way that it's there in human sexuality. You may remember that the orgasm sexually is known as the little death. So there is a curious way in which, in Western culture, ecstasy and death always come together. Ecstasy and death. And so, I mean, you think of the great love stories. How often death is, as it were, there almost before the love. Yeah. In fact, someone called Wagner's great story, Tristan and Isolde, they called it death at first sight. Not love at first sight, but death at first sight. So, yeah, this is a strange area. A lot of people may think that it's not a healthy area to go in. I actually think, and this accords with what I said to you at the very beginning, that we really have to explore these ideas because they are there. They have influenced our culture quite profoundly, and they haven't gone away. But I also think that some of the great literature of the Western culture, some of the greatest literature, has been born out of an obsession with death, and particularly the way it relates to human sexuality.
That's interesting. Actually, I came across a quote by Paul Auster, the American writer, where he said, actually, I grow dead in the face of death. That's what he said. I grow dead in the face of death. Now, actually, death was a subject that was often avoided in the academia. Yeah. Sven Lundquist, for example, said death was never mentioned in his education during his college years or his school years. And now you're bringing it back to focus. But at the same time, I don't know how much academia will be paying attention to the topic called death. But this also brings our discussion to another area which you are interested, it seems, because you had recently talked about how universities produce a kind of mediocrity, and one has to go around formal education to actually learn life. Yes. So, what do you say? What's your own take on the present condition of universities in the UK and the West?
Okay, just to take your first point briefly first, academics may well avoid death. Artists never have.
Yeah, right.
I mean, for artists of any kind, death has been one of their most fertile subjects. Okay. Now, coming back to the point about mediocrity, I think that this has always been the case in the academy, that second-rate people have come to control it, but it has been particularly pronounced in the last maybe 20 years in my country since the universities have been privatized. For example, what has happened is that often quite second-rate academics have realized that they're not going to have a great career as writers or as teachers, and they have gone off into an alternative career in administration. Yeah. And they have been administering the cutbacks, the controls, the marketizing forces, the privatizing of the universities. And often those very same people, when it comes to appointing people, have said, well, we want someone who won't rock the boat. Okay, we could have this brilliant scholar from, such and such institution, but she's a bit kind of challenging. We don't know what she's going to say. She might upset the boat. Why don't we take this guy over here? Because actually, we know, he's tame, he's quiet, he'll do what he's told. And after all, what do we want him to do? Now the university is a business. We really only want him to teach a few students, teach the students, keep them happy, and keep us happy. So I think that the mediocrity is built now into the structure of the system. I'm not saying it was marvelously better before, but it certainly is built into the system now. And I think that our universities, and I won't find any friends back home for saying this, but I think our universities are now controlled by second-rate people.
That's interesting, but I think mediocrity is being globalized now.
Yeah, maybe.
Corporatized and marketized. Mm-hmm. And people like you try to rock the boat, and that was great. But did you really succeed in rocking the boat and, throwing a few people off the boat and, but did you quit the academia? By choosing to quit the academia, actually you lost a precious opportunity, I think, to rock the boat and probably to take it to some new shores.
Well, I left the academy about 12 years ago because I no longer wanted to be a part of what was happening. I left it because I wanted to write differently, I wanted to think differently, I wanted to read differently, and I have absolutely no regrets about that. At the time when I was in it, of course our influence was limited. And as I said in the lecture this morning, I think one of our greatest failures was that we did not resist this privatizing of the universities, because it was such a precious base for freedom of thought, and I think it is no longer. People are controlled in the universities around what they write and really what they can think, and that's a failure, a big failure. So history will probably look back and say that the influence that we had was very, very limited, but then you do what you can from where you are.
So Dr. Dollimore has quit the academia. It's a loss for his particular academic institution, but I think it's going to be a gain for the wider academic community because he's more into writing and has produced more books and more revolutionary insights. I wish all the best luck to Dr. Dollimore, but I do fear whether even that's going to be marketized and commercialized in our world day. Okay, thank you. Thank you for being with us, sir.
Thank you.